They said it wasn't humanly possible. All the power and excitement of...
This video here has been a long time coming. After all, if you've been following my series of shorts here on YouTube, you'll know that I've since recovered my long-lost collection of Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. I have no idea what happened to my original collection that I had. Most likely they're in a box that one of my exes has, or they were purged during one of the moves I've done a long time ago. The loss of these games undoubtedly sucks, as a few of these were also my brothers who had recently passed away. Thankfully, though, I have since reacquired this collection, as well as added to it many titles that I've played through other means. The original Game Boy released July 31st, 1989. Its chief engineer was Gunpei Yokoi and the Nintendo R&D 1 team. Yokoi was also responsible for other Nintendo hardware, such as the early Game & Watch series of handhelds, as well as the Virtual Boy. He's also responsible for helping to develop the original Donkey Kong with Shigeru Miyamoto, as well as other series such as Metroid and Kid Icarus. The Game Boy Color, now, was released November 18th, 1998. This system is essentially like the original Game Boy, though with a color screen and one with the quality akin to the updated Game Boy Pocket variety. The Game Boy Color does have twice the processing power and 3 times the RAM of the original Game Boy as well. Though, because Nintendo reports both regular Game Boy and its color variety within the same sales umbrella, my top 10 video will do the same. Do note, I won't be including the Game Boy Advance on this top 10 list. If Nintendo separates it from their sales, I will as well on my top lists. Also, regarding exclusions, I will not be including any Pokemon games on my list. This means that there will be no Pokemon Red, Green, Blue, Yellow, Gold, Silver, or Crystal. Now, there's nothing wrong with these games. In fact, many could validly argue that these are great games full of fantastic content. I missed the boat on playing Pokemon at this time during those original releases, and just never got into it, until recently, of course, with Arceus on the Switch. I've seen other magazine outlets, YouTube content creators, and the like state that these games, especially Pokemon Red and Blue, land within the top 10 of many of these lists, but again, they won't be on mine. Another exclusion is that only wholly unique games that differentiate themselves from their respective series on main TV-based consoles for their time, such as the NES or SNES, will appear on my top 10 list here. Straight-up Game Boy ports of NES games, like Millen's Secret Castle, DuckTales, and Dr. Mario, are therefore out of bounds. Though admittedly, these probably wouldn't have made my top 10 list. Millen's NES counterpart wouldn't have appeared this high. I prefer to play DuckTales on the big screen and in full color, and I like the color designations for the pills in Dr. Mario on the console versions, as it makes them stand out better. Other games that are fairly close to their console counterparts, like Donkey Kong Land 2 and 3, and Bionic Commando, also wouldn't make the cut due to being too close, though Bionic Commando is close to appearing on this list just because it's such a good port. But before I roll into my list, I wanted to give a few honorable mentions. Honorable mention, Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages and Seasons for the Game Boy Color. I never owned these when they first came out, and I did buy them via my Nintendo 3DS Virtual Console and tried to play them, but unfortunately they just couldn't keep my attention. I felt they were too similar to Link's Awakening, which makes sense since these two are based off of that game's engine. I'm giving these an honorable mention to hopefully appease the Zelda fanboy gods. Honorable mention, Gargoyle's Quest for the Game Boy. Starring as one of the enemy gargoyles from the Ghosts and Goblins series named Firebrand, it mixed an overworld-style map and town structure along with random battle encounters that led to action-based fighting. This kind of reminded me of how Zelda 2 Link's Adventure on the NES worked, and it was a really cool concept. Honorable mention, Mario Golf for the Game Boy Color. So this one looks like it'd be a handheld version of the Nintendo 64's Mario Golf, since it does have similar art to the console, but this Game Boy Color's claim to fame is its story mode. The player controls a non-Mario character that can take advantage of RPG-like mechanics to level up and improve their character's skills in the game. This ultimately paved the way for games like Golf Story and the upcoming Sports Story that have employed this type of mechanic to greater effect. Honorable mention, Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge for the Game Boy. If Castlevania The Adventure is probably the worst entry in the 2D line of Castlevania games, this sequel of Belmont's Revenge redeems the series and then some. Christopher Belmont moves much quicker, gameplay and platforming is fairer, and the overall fun factor is greatly improved. And by far, the best aspect is the absolutely fantastic soundtrack. Honorable mention, Dragon Warrior 3 for the Game Boy Color. Okay, so I'm kinda already breaking my rule of no ports or whatnot from NES and SNES games, and that's why this is just an honorable mention. I simply had to mention this just because of how great this version of Dragon Quest Warrior 3 is. It has all the content of the Japanese-only SNES update, the looks of the NES game, and overall is fantastic. And now, on to the top 10. Number 10. Kirby's Dream Land 1 and 2, released 1992 and 1995 for the Game Boy. The first Kirby's Dream Land is of course the first game ever to star Kirby. The pink puff here wasn't actually pink, at least according to the US box art. He was pink for the Japanese one. Kirby's overall look is an homage to John Kirby, the lawyer that helped win Nintendo their lawsuit when Universal City Studios sued them in 1984 due to the name Donkey Kong, possibly infringing upon the name King Kong. This first Kirby entry sees him not have his titular ability to swallow and copy enemies' abilities. Despite this, the game itself is actually quite fun and generally pretty easy. Platforming itself is fun, the music is light and peppy, and the enemies and environments are cheerful and simple. The actual game begins when the player is advised of the extra game mode. At the title screen, press up, A, and select unlocks this, and it's this mode that's probably one of the hardest challenges for a Kirby game. The second entry, which actually released after Kirby's second overall game, Kirby's Adventure on the NES, sees Kirby have his copying abilities. Animal friends are also introduced for the first time as well. Their continued presence in future games honestly depends on the entry, as they're not in every Kirby game. There are a much wider variety of environments than the first Dreamland game with a ton more levels. This entry is also compatible with the SNES Super Game Boy accessory, which really makes the colors and everything look great. It sucks they never got games compatible with this accessory to show these colors in future Game Boy iterations like the Game Boy Color and Advance. There's a number of secrets in this second entry, which helps to unlock the quote-unquote true villain and thus the best ending. Both of these games are great fun, and thankfully have inspired a number of fantastic Kirby games that still go to this day. Number 9. Final Fantasy Legend 2, released November 1991 for the Game Boy. The Final Fantasy Legend series, of course, were Final Fantasy games in name only. In Japan, they were part of a new sub-series called Saga. Hoping to draw upon the popularity of the Final Fantasy name, these 3 total entries were given this brand. And keep in mind, of course, the true popularity of Final Fantasy really wasn't there as much until the release of Final Fantasy VII in 1997. This is why Sunsoft reproduced more cartridges of these 3 entries on the Game Boy after 1997, and why some of them show Sunsoft on them. While Dragon Warrior 3 is the better overall RPG for the Game Boy series, Final Fantasy Legend 2 is the better wholly unique game for this console. It sees a similar turn-based battle format, with the player characters facing enemies akin to Dragon Warrior, differing from the American football-style players are used to seeing in mainline series Final Fantasy entries. Players select their main character and 3 additional party members based on 4 different races: humans, mutants, espers in the Japanese version, monsters, and robots. Things like stat progression, learning abilities, transforming to different monsters, and equipment durability are determined by this choice of race. Regarding the last point, nearly every weapon has a limit on how many times it can be used before it breaks and disappears. All 3 entries saw this, though I felt that Legend 2 had the best variety of races and overall equipment available. It's also the entry that is the most fair. Legend 1 saw a very high random enemy encounter rate with battles that could often wipe the player, especially in late game. Legend 2 has its difficulty, no doubt, but again, it's quite fair. In fact, the main character and their classmates that will make the journey has their teacher, Mr. S, immediately join the party as a guest character in the beginning to help them out. It's with this assistance that allows the player to learn the overall mechanics without getting annihilated right away. The story itself sees the main character trying to find their father, who's been searching for the 77 Magi Stones among many different worlds to prevent evil beings from collecting these themselves. Admittedly, it's not the most in-depth story, with emotional beats similar to a mainline Final Fantasy game, but honestly it is pretty decent for a portable RPG at its time. There are surprises as the story goes along, which are always fun to see through. The music is also pretty decent as well, with great themes that match the environment of the player. Though I've heard the main battle theme so much that I think it sounds similar to a theme from Eddie Murphy's Beverly Hills Cop. Am I going crazy? Number 8. Wario Land, released March 13th, 1994 for the Game Boy. This technically has the subtitle of Super Mario Land 3, which I think was done to show the Land series as a trilogy, while also keeping recognition of the Mario name overall. To that end, Mario himself doesn't appear until the player beats the game, and it's a quick cameo at that. After being the main villain in Super Mario Land 2 by stealing Mario's castle, Wario is out to get a castle for himself again. He's out to find as many coins and treasures as he can by raiding the pirates at Kitchen Island. Once the player beats the game, Wario cashes out all the treasures and uses the total coins acquired to buy a castle. I always felt this was really cool, as it gives the player incentive to replay their save file to get as many coins as possible, as well as explore every nook and cranny to find treasures. Nintendo sort of went back to the well on this with New Super Mario Bros. 2 for the Nintendo 3DS. This specific game was a standard game in the New Super Mario series. While it emphasized coin collection, doing so brought additional bonuses to the title screen. Well, at least it's not for nothing there. Wario Land's music is okay. Admittedly not as good as Super Mario Land 2's was. It's also generally a slower game than Land 2, with Wario himself moving slower than Mario. One big reason is because Wario doesn't dash if the player holds down the B button like Mario can. This slower pace is due to the game emphasizing exploration versus just completing the level like with standard Mario games for the time. Wario has a number of interesting power-ups. His standard form swaps his hat for a jungle hat, with additional power-ups giving him horns, a dragon's head, or jets on his hat. While only one of these additional power-ups can be worn at a time, they allow him to charge longer and stick to the ceiling, spit fire from the hat itself, and fly horizontally, respectively. Depending on the need, these allow better exploration and/or taking out enemies and bosses quicker. The levels are quite varied, with fun variations on some of the water, lava, and ice levels that are par for the course for a Mario game. Number 7. Final Fantasy Adventure, released November 1991 for the Game Boy. The best way to describe this game is if Square made a Final Fantasy entry with gameplay just like a top-down Zelda game. After all, it has weapons that are required for forward progression, fighting enemies right on the screen with said weapons, and dungeons with puzzles. Where it deviates is with its detailed story. Okay, well, honestly, no, it doesn't much here either. The player controls the main hero, who is the chosen one from a lineage of Gemma Knights that can wield the holy sword Excalibur, who must protect the last descendant of the Mana family and strike down an existential evil that's threatening the world. This is essentially the basic plot for so many Zelda games, swapping the Gemma Knights with Hyrule Knights, Excalibur for the Master Sword, and the last descendant with Princess Zelda. There is a bunch of Final Fantasy flavoring here to thankfully make this feel like its own experience. This includes sprites pulled ad nauseum from NES console entries, bosses like 3 of the 4 Fiends, including one boss called Iflight, whose name is clearly a mistranslation from the now common stable Ifrit, and of course, Chocobos. The gameplay and battling feels different from a Zelda game, but it still feels and controls quite solidly. Also, like a Final Fantasy game, it has an experience system with levels up and allowing the player to allocate certain stat gains any way they wish. Though I suppose Zelda 2 had this as well. Zelda 2 also had magic, which Final Fantasy Adventure has, using many of the series' staples such as Fire, Ice, Lit, and Cure. I should also mention the music, which is probably one of the best soundtracks on the Game Boy. The endless battle theme that first plays as the hero explores the main overworld promises adventure. Amanda's theme is one of loss that truly marks the player, especially with how this loss occurs, and the Dime Tower theme lends an ethereal sense to the player as they climb this large tower looking to confront the evil Julius and stop the destruction of the mana tree. And regarding said tree, it's important to note that this entry was the first one in the now long-running Mana series. Its first console entry was The Secret of Mana for the SNES, which is the sequel to Final Fantasy Adventure. Remakes for this game on the Game Boy Advance and mobile iOS have been titled Sword of Mana and Adventure of Mana, respectively. It also wasn't released as Final Fantasy Adventure in Japan and Europe. It was known as Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden and Mystic Quest, respectively. And finally, this also got a re-release like the Final Fantasy Legend series did in 1998, taking advantage of Final Fantasy VII's popularity. This game is available as part of the Collection of Mana available on all current major consoles. Absolutely recommend picking this collection up as all 3 games on it are fantastic. Number 6. Game & Watch Gallery 1 through 3. Released between 1997 and 1999 for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. I feel like this series of games are some of the most underrated on this system. Each entry contains both ports and Mario-based remakes of several games from Nintendo's Game & Watch series. As a small history lesson, the Game & Watch handhelds were designed by Nintendo R&D 1 head Gunpei Yokoi that I mentioned before, and first released in 1980. It features a single game on one LCD screen, though there were dual screens later. They were simple games that ultimately tested the management of players' skills and resources through games like Manhole, Fire, Ball, and the like. Each of the Game & Watch Gallery games for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color contain anywhere from 4 to 7 of these entries, plus an additional museum feature showing the players other games that were on the Game & Watch devices. I still believe these titles are some of the best bang for your buck you can get. They all also allow you to do a quick save on your progress, to be resumed later, something not seen on the original LCD handhelds. Gameplay differs for whichever game the player selects in any of these 3 entries to the Game & Watch Gallery series. All of the games see gameplay get quicker the more points they earn by completing whatever task they must do. The difficulty and speed increases as their point total increases, with speed generally getting higher closer to whenever the player reaches a multiple of 100, especially a multiple of 200. This is because for every multiple of 200, the player earns a star, with 5 being the highest. The difficulty and speed no longer decrease once the player crosses 1,000 points. It maintains its chaotic nature until the player ultimately loses. For every game, the player can get away with failing twice, until the 3rd time results in a game over. 3 strikes, you're out. In the Mario-based remakes, sometimes the player can gain a heart to recover one of these failures. My most heart attack-inducing times playing these have always been when my point total is in the 900s, as that's when I'm so close to hitting 1,000 and getting that 5th star, but everything is always so crazy. Thankfully, the music for the Mario-based remakes are decent, and keeps themselves from being too annoying, especially if the player is going to be playing these for several minutes at a time. The ports of the original LCD games have no music, with the only audio being the various beeping that comes with playing these titles. Your mileage may vary on these, but I've heard of these being annoying to some. I also feel these original ports tend to be a bit tougher than the Mario-based remakes. Number 5. Super Mario Land 2, 6 Golden Coins, released November 2nd, 1992 for the Game Boy. This is a fantastic Mario game overall, released just after Super Mario World came out on the Super Nintendo. It feels like how a Super Mario World game would run on the Game Boy, except of course without Yoshi. It even has a spin jump, though this is activated by pressing down whenever Mario normally jumps. It's still effective at breaking bricks and stomping on enemies. This overall is a great sequel to the first Super Mario Land, which I felt was good, but just not enough to appear on this top 10 list overall. And that's because that entry is just way too short, with only 12 playable levels and sprites that are super small. Mario also controls pretty similarly to how he did in the original NES Super Mario Bros., which is okay, but later Mario games had him control better. Super Mario Land 2 sees Mario trying to recover the castle he had on his own private island from a jealous childhood acquaintance named Wario. Now Mario must free the lands on his island to recover and... Wait, Mario's got his own island? Well, he did collect all those coins during all his adventures, though I thought they all disappeared once they tallied to 100 so he can gain an extra life. Funny story points aside, the game has a wide variety of different worlds. This includes mechanized Mario Land, Japanese Horror Land, and my favorite, being Space Land, among others. The levels themselves are really great, with some interesting mechanics within each of them. My only issue I have with the game is it's easy, perhaps too easy. The toughest level is easily the last one, Wario's Castle, due to the length as well as the hazards that will come with all the platforming and enemies. The bosses, including Wario himself, are also pretty easy. This is partly due to Mario's Fire Flower power-up coming back, as well as the new Carrot power-up, which gives Mario bunny ears to float very slowly down. The entry also has some great music, with my favorites being the main theme that plays in the first level, as well as the Space Zones theme. The whole adventure also doesn't last very long, which makes this a fun escape I usually do maybe once every year or so. Number 4. Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening DX, released December 15th, 1998 for the Game Boy Color. This game is essentially a new adventure for Link based on the general engine of Link to the Past for the SNES. However, instead of large sections of the map that are freely available, this game only has a movable screen by screen, just like the first entry on the NES. Not only does the overworld work this way, of course the dungeons do as well. Large sections of the map do open up for the Nintendo Switch version. I like this one the best out of the 3 versions available, but we're doing a top 10 Game Boy list, not Switch list, yet. Beyond the Nintendo Switch version, there's the regular Game Boy one and this Game Boy Color one. I like the Color one better simply because these colors give the game personality beyond what was already there on the standard version, and there was a ton of it on there. I normally don't like extra superfluous crap to existing games, and fortunately I can ignore most of this on the Game Boy Color version. The story itself sees Link, from Link to the Past, on a ship voyage encounter a bad storm where he ends up getting washed up ashore on a large island with a big mysterious egg at the top of a mountain there. This egg is called the Windfish's Egg. Sealed within by the nightmare into an endless sleep is a godlike being who has power over reality itself. This is probably one of my favorite stories for a Zelda game, one that was quite deep for this series at the time. There are a couple of twists in the plot, including a what if, should the player manage to beat the game without dying. The characters in the game are cute and full of personality as well, with the young Marin getting the most development in the story by far. Gameplay also sees an overhead-style action much like the first and third entries on the NES and SNES respectively. One cool aspect with the game is that there are a number of dungeons that go 2D side view, much like how Zelda 2 for the NES was. Link can use a tool he gets in the first dungeon, Rock's Feather, to jump, making accessibility much easier, and so he can stomp on Goombas. Yep, there's Goombas in this, along with Cheep Cheeps, Piranha Plants, and even Kirby, though also as an enemy. Justification for all of this in such heavy quantities is the dreamlike quality that the game has itself. Regarding the tools in the menu, it is quite annoying in both Game Boy versions to have to switch between everything in the menu, assigning them all to just 2 buttons, A and B. Fortunately, this was corrected as well in the Nintendo Switch version, adding to that being the best version of this game. One thing I dislike in later Zelda games is the lack or lower amount of dungeons. Thankfully, Link's Awakening provides the player with 8, though having to find keys to access them all, many by doing quests for villagers, does get annoying. Regardless, the dungeons themselves are chock full of fun puzzles and decently challenging bosses. The only dungeon and its puzzles that usually causes me trouble is level 7 Eagle's Tower. This is such a great game, one that landed on my number 4 list on my top 10 Legend of Zelda games for a reason. The original Game Boy version is available to play on the Legend of Zelda Game & Watch handheld, with the Nintendo Switch version available right now as well. Number 3. Tetris and Tetris DX, released 1989 and 1998 for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Going slightly against my wholly unique rule here to include the original Tetris on Game Boy, but in doing so I'm recognizing what really helped to put Tetris on the map for a lot of people. Now, I personally have more fond memories with the NES version, and that one was one of the very few video games that nearly everyone in my household played, each of us taking turns getting as far as we could in A-Type, scoring as high as we could as well. But the Game Boy one allowed two-player competition, something me and my brothers could do since we got the link cables and there were at least 2 Game Boys between the 3 of us. There's a large story regarding the development for the NES and Game Boy versions of Tetris and the game Tetris overall. I recommend checking out YouTube content creator Gaming Historian's video for that full story. The link is in the description. I thought the Game Boy version came out first in the US. Instead, it was the NES version that did in December 1988. Again, the Game Boy one came out June 14th of 1989. It was the Game Boy version that has the classic main Tetris theme that everyone equates with this and has followed a large number of ports since then. I've added the Game Boy Color version Tetris DX because of what it features. It has a couple additional modes, such as the versus CPU one, as well as a feature to actually save the scores players reach once they've completed or finished a game. Where these additions are great, it got rid of the classic music Tetris is known for. There's also an exploit that certain blocks or tetraminos can be pinned to the wall while falling, and when rotated continuously causes the tetraminos to actually rise up, negating the normal fall. Regardless of these qualms, DX is also a great Tetris game that's worthy of this spot in this list. There's nothing better than the thrill of beating your older brother's best score and showing them that on your Game Boy. Yes, they'll get mad, turn the Game Boy off, and erase your score on the original Game Boy version, but a win is a win. Number 2. Mega Man's 3 through 5, released between 1992 and 1994 for the Game Boy. This is an odd selection as I'm skipping the first 2 entries for the series on the Game Boy, as well as the fact that a number of these are like ports from their original NES versions. These are good points and I'll touch upon these in a moment. First off, it should be known that the simply named Mega Man series on the Game Boy was called Rockman World in Japan, which allowed it to be easily delineated as something different from just the standard Rockman title there. The first 4 Mega Man games feature robots unique to each respective entry. These were called Mega Man Killer Robots, which also allow the Blue Bomber to learn an ability upon their defeat, much like the standard Robot Master. Beyond this, each Game Boy Mega Man game featured Robot Masters from the NES console games, though ordered differently. For example, Mega Man 1 for the Game Boy pulled 8 total Robot Masters and their respective stages from the NES Mega Man games, 4 from the first entry and 4 from the second. This continued up to and including through the 4th entry. Thankfully, the Dr. Wily stages were not pulled from the NES entries and were wholly unique. Because of these many differences, that's why I'm including these on my list. But why cut off the first 2 Game Boy entries on my top 10? The platforming and gameplay is fine with the first one, with graphics and sprites pulled directly from the Mega Man series, and to me though, it's just a bit rougher on the edges, and it feels like the creators are still getting used to fitting the gameplay onto the smaller screen. What is probably the most jarring is that Mega Man's sprite pulled from the NES version didn't shrink at all. It makes him look much larger on the Game Boy, and I feel like the developers took some time to get used to this. Perhaps too much time, as Capcom went to a different company than the first Game Boy entry to develop the second Game Boy one, and it shows. While the music in the first Game Boy entry sounds fairly low quality, the second entry keeps that low quality and changes the music completely from the original NES entries. The levels are fairly close to their NES counterparts, though admittedly there's just something that feels off about the gameplay overall with this second Game Boy one. All of these issues for both of these first 2 entries are completely remedied with the third and fourth ones on the Game Boy. The music is absolutely phenomenal. It keeps the spirit and quality of their original NES counterparts, allowing full immersion in stages that also look as good as their NES version as well, albeit of course in black and white. Gameplay is peak Mega Man, feeling like the NES games as well. The biggest payoff for both of these entries are the Dr. Wily stages, being wholly unique stages that are quite challenging and also fair. The best entry by far though in the Game Boy series must go to the fifth one. Instead of keeping the formula of pulling from the NES entries, Capcom instead opted to create their own wholly new game with new robot masters, modeled after planets in the solar system and also designed by the original series creator Keiji Inafune. This was also the last entry for the Game Boy, as well as the last time Mega Man would appear in his 8-bit form, at least until Mega Man 9 came out nearly 15 years later. And those Mega Man killer robots that I mentioned earlier, they all appear in Mega Man 5 as well. Capcom had plans to release a Mega Man collection for these Game Boy games back when the first Mega Man Anniversary Collection released for the PS2 and GameCube around 2003. It was cancelled later for unknown reasons, with fans only able to speculate. With how many Mega Man collections they have released for the current generation of systems, as well as the upcoming Mega Man Battle Network Legacy Collection, I hope they finally release this Game Boy compilation. Number 1. Donkey Kong 94, released July 22nd, 1994 for the Game Boy. While this game's title is just simply Donkey Kong, most fans of it add the 94 after it, differentiating it from the original arcade version. This is much like how they call the abomination Sonic the Hedgehog 06 to differentiate that horror from the original classic Sonic game that released back in 1991. Unlike that comparison, Donkey Kong 94 is an absolute gem. The game starts off as a beat-for-beat remake of the arcade Donkey Kong, up to and including the 4 levels and how Mario rescues Pauline. Instead of going gently into that good night, Donkey Kong recovers from his fall, abducts Pauline again, and Mario gives chase. And he continues this chase through 9 worlds comprised of 97 individual stages. These 97 stages are nothing like the first 4 were, as the game takes the form of a puzzle platformer. Mario must find a key and use it to open a door and thus exit and complete the level he's in. Every 4th level sees Mario either face Donkey Kong or literally duel him in a boss battle. And Mario is nearly as fragile as he was in the arcade version. 1 hit and he's dead, with no power-ups to increase how many hits he can take like other Mario games. Unlike the original arcade version, he can fall more without dying, but even this has its limits. There are power-up mushrooms in the game, except they shrink poor Mario. Thankfully though, Mario is graced with the spirit of a gymnast, as he can now handstand. If Mario performs this with the right rhythm, he can perform a triple jump, exceeding heights with his standard one. Mario can also perform a backflip if he skids in one direction and quickly jumps. Do these 2 abilities sound familiar? This, combined with Yoshi's Ground Pound from 1995's Yoshi's Island, helped give birth to a large swath of Mario's moveset in 1996's Super Mario 64. In Donkey Kong 94, keeping with the gymnastic spirit, Mario can also climb wires, spin around them, and jump to reach further heights. The hammer is also back from the original arcade title. Mario can't jump while using it just like there, but thankfully he can throw it up in the air at any time, thus allowing additional mobility if Mario can jump up and catch it on a higher platform. With all of these abilities at Mario's disposal, these 97 levels are a bit less daunting. What's really cool too is that Donkey Kong Jr. comes by not long after the start of the game to help his pops with his kidnapping. The music is usually pretty cheery, matching the aesthetics of the worlds and levels that Mario travels in. The last world's music though, especially the boss themes, are by far the best in the game. This is because the player knows by the music that the stakes have risen the highest that they have in the entire game, especially that last final battle. Now my only complaint with the game is the sheer length, and it can be a bit off-putting, especially with the 8th world and its own 16 stages that are kind of drab due to its Rocky Mountain setting, giving everything a sort of samey-like look to it. With some of the best gameplay though, high amount of quality levels with great design to play through, and a Mario that controls absolutely fantastic, this is the best Game Boy game. So what did you think of my overall list? Do you agree, or do you sort the games around in another order? Let me know in the comments section below. Also, did you notice I only had a couple Game Boy Color games on this list? It did only have 3 years of games before the Game Boy Advance release in 2001. Future top 10 lists, including one for the Game Boy Advance, will be coming in the future, so please make sure to like, subscribe, and ring that bell for notifications when I release these. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.